Hello and welcome to the second webinar we've had today from Cambridge University Press. This webinar is Basic Literacy in ELT, presented by Gary Pathare. I'm Simon Wright from Cambridge University Press, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Eve Lloyd and Sarah Stokes. This webinar is part of a series of academic webinars running all of the rest of this week until Friday, so to find out further information and to sign up to any other talks, please visit cambridge.org/academic-english, where you'll see a box advertising the conference with a link in it. So during today's webinar you'll be able to hear our speaker and see the slides, but you won't be able to see Gary. You won't need a microphone, and if you do want to ask a question, please use the chat box that you'll see on screen, and I'll make sure that I put questions to Gary at the end of the session. The recording of today's webinar should be available in about a week or so's time on the registration page. You'll be able to download a certificate of attendance for the webinar from a link that will appear on the screen at the end. So, a little bit of background. Gary has taught English in the Dubai HCT Foundations program since 2001, after 10 years teaching English and teacher training in Spain. His main professional interest is in developing and sharing new teaching approaches and materials to support them. So, over to you, Gary.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. That was the first literacy issue came up just now. It's Pathare, not Pathare, but that's because it's an Indian name. Anyway,
sorry.
So yeah, that's fine. You're not the first. So to my friends, it's great looking at the list of people coming in. My friends around the world, hello, bonjour, konnichiwa, hola, bon dia. And this is a current picture of me. I'm 56 now. And it did occur to me that this is quite a strange situation because you can't see me and I can't see you. And I don't even know if anybody's actually there. Because I've been in these situations before where I've seen, you might well be on your phone kind of looking at pictures of pizzas from last night. But equally, I might be not here. If you think about it, I could have recorded this, including all the mistakes. And I can't get any feedback, obviously, if you found that a joke or... So we're in a post-truth world here. And that photo isn't now. The smarter people among you have realized that it's not Dubai in the background. That's actually just around Barcelona, which is where I was teaching before. And I love teaching in Barcelona. I had a great time, and I became, I think, a really good teacher while teaching there. I know I'm a good teacher. I knew I was a good teacher because people learned from my teaching. So I would teach beginners using, for example, a book like this, New Cambridge English 1. I taught it 18 times. To real beginners in Barcelona, and it was great. We had a real laugh, and then 4 or 5 years later I'd be teaching the same students, and now they'd be doing advanced or proficiency English, and they'd acquired a huge amount of vocabulary. There would be C1, although we didn't know it then. They were using structures that were well above the level that they started at, and we had a lot of fun doing it. Half the time my students are running around finding people who had eaten an orange or had ridden a motorbike. And with more advanced students, I often used to teach by a Saturday morning class. I would cut out I'd read The Guardian, I'd buy The Guardian on the way to class, find something really interesting, cut it out, photocopy it, share it, and then we'd spend the whole class, maybe 2 hours, discussing the content and then looking at the language of that particular article. And it worked. So I'm not stupid. So when I came to Dubai, I thought, I know how to teach. I'll just do that. And I did that. I used the same kind of approach, which I'd also been training people in, a communicative approach or post-communicative approach. Disappointing a couple of years later when I saw my same students again who had continued learning, and I realized they hadn't really progressed in the way that I'd expect them to. They hadn't acquired lots more structures. They were still using the same ones. What had worked before wasn't working so well now. It's the situation. And I started to think about why and started to adapt what I was doing. And I think if you look at the lesson, now you're going to have to put your phones down and put your feet down and lean forward and look at the little screen here. This is a typical lesson from a course book, a very good course book, actually, an excellent course book by Swan and Water. And this was the first lesson. And if you look at it, the students would come in and they'd never spoken English before. We had real beginners in those days. And I'd play this tape with these little dialogues, and they would read the little box, what's your name? Hello, my name's this. And then I would stop the tape, and they would write in things that they thought were the right answers, or the right parts of the dialogue. And I'd repeat that process until they were all complete. Then we'd practice it. So they'd practice in pairs, work on the dialogue, and I'd work on the pronunciation with them, maybe using finger modeling to show my name is, my name's, putting the name is together to show that that was actually a contraction. And by the end of the lesson, they'd be walking around introducing themselves in a communicative way. But also, if you look at the top box, they'd have done a bit of grammar. They did is. They'd learned that is was is, and it could be shortened to s, and so on. So they'd actually started acquiring language. And I think if you look at that, there's a major problem for the context that I'm in now, because there's a huge assumption here. My assumption, which no one ever challenged me on, I did this 18 times, the same lesson, no one ever said, you're assuming that they can read and write. And I was assuming they could read and write English, even though they were all real beginners. And I never considered the fact that that was an assumption, because of course they could write. They were literate. They were Spanish people, been to school and so on. And I would assume that they could write. But that is an assumption which you can't necessarily make. The reason that they could write and read English was because English reading and writing, or literacy, is so close to Spanish. There may be some differences, like hello would be hello in Spanish, because the H would be read like that. But in general, it was a reasonable assumption to make. But if you think about if that was in Arabic, and my name is would look like that. I'm not very good at Arabic. It would be reasonable to say that so ismi Gary. If I did reverse the whole process and you were asked to put that into a dialogue box, if not, as a non-Arabic speaker, I think you'd find that very hard, because the actual system is completely different. So, Ismi Gary also is something like name my Gary. So my finger modeling wouldn't have worked either. And there's no is there that I can see. So the idea of acquiring grammar through that would have been very difficult. This is a mugshot of me when I arrived in Dubai. So that's sort of 18, 19 years ago. And I'm now a faculty rather than just a teacher. I have to admit, I also, this is real, this is now. And it just goes to show, you can't trust what you see on the internet. But and also there's another bit of I said konnichiwa for the Japanese, and I know that would have upset one or two people who can read Japanese, because it doesn't say konnichiwa. It actually, I think it says fish cake, which is very different. But even if you knew the word konnichiwa and you didn't know the script of Japanese, then you wouldn't have known that there was a problem there, because it's completely invisible. So I've called this what is basic literacy, and I started off thinking this session was about basic literacy. I think it's about more than that, actually. I think it's a bit deeper. But just to think about what is basic literacy, what's the root of this? It's a two-way code. Any literacy is a code. It's an invention. It's not the same as language in itself. Language has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and we're not sure how it originated, but we know that we're adapted to it. But in writing literacy is an invention that may have happened in different places, and it's learned. It's not acquired. And we know it's learned. If you have children like I do who have been through school, it takes a long time to learn literacy, and it's taught by literacy experts known as primary school teachers. And they train. They don't go around expecting it to be acquired. They ask students, for example, to learn how to trace letters in the way that you can see on the right of the picture. And they teach them the relationships of the sounds in the letters. For example, apple is an A, but the second one has a magic E, so it's A. And the third one has an R, so it's R. And the next one is E, because it's with an EA. And it took many years for my children to learn literacy. And now they can do it. But without having that training, they wouldn't have been able to do that. And I think that could be the situation for some of our students. Basic literacy includes I've got a cross here. You can see the cross, and I think literacy we have to see as a crossroads between reading and writing. It's not one or the other. Basic literacy is the understanding that a letter represents sound, possibly, and also that we have to learn to form that letter. So there's a connection between the writing and the reading of it. We can recognize words and we can spell words, and they go hand in hand. We can understand sentences and we can write sentences following a structure which would be understood by anybody literate in our particular language. We can understand the relationships between ideas and sentences. The organization going above basic literacy possibly would start to understand how ideas connect through devices which are pure invention and which differ from different languages. They're not a given. It doesn't have to be a particular way. It so happens that English has spaces between words, but that's not necessarily true of other languages. And capitalization, for example, helps us a lot, but it's not something you'd find in Arabic. And no one can answer me back because because it's not interactive. You can write a question. So what can we do? What can be done? If you're looking at that and thinking, well, that's a bit extreme, what can be done? Okay. The sentence below is a real sentence from one of my students. The schools is very doog. And those of you who have taught, for example, in Arab culture, might recognize that they've put good and they've got it the wrong way around. And that's a very common mistake to be made and perfectly understandable given the differences in Arabic and English writing convention. But what can be done? Well, ideally, talking as a tertiary teacher in an educational establishment, ideally we wouldn't have to do anything because the schools would have dealt with this beforehand, and that would obviously be the best way. It doesn't have to be done at primary level because it's not. We don't lose the ability to learn literacy of this type later in the same way as we might find it more difficult to learn language. But it would be great if the schools employed people to ensure that everybody entering tertiary education had a level of developed literacy that would be helpful for them in that situation. But that might not be the case for everybody. And I don't want to imply that this is a general problem, but quite a lot of people do slip through a net where they haven't developed the literacy required for tertiary education. Sorry, I just went on forward. Given the fact that might not be the case, I think the best we can do, the next best thing would be to make sure that all teachers in a situation like this were actually trained in literacy. And at the moment, that's not the case. My research for my master's, I interviewed all the teachers in my college at the time in my department to find out how they'd been trained in terms of literacy in their courses, in their masters and their deltas and so on. And there was virtually nothing. It hadn't been addressed because it hadn't been perceived as a problem. I think that needs to be changed. But given the fact that might not be changed in the short term, what could be done? I think my answer to that is we need to be addressing this on a day-to-day basis alongside the rest of our teaching. And that involves changing materials and changing methodology in a fairly subtle way. Well, not necessarily subtle, but in a way that addresses the fact that literacy needs to be helped along. So, for example, and this is just an example because there's lots of areas of literacy, handwriting. Handwriting is a learnt skill. And as I say, it is normally taught by experts. And some students come to college and they haven't got good handwriting skills. They can't form letters. They don't know how an A is formed. They draw little fish, for example. And what we can do is to diagnose that. So if we build into our teaching, for example, a diagnostic handwriting exercise, this is one I have. So I say to the students, it takes 5 minutes, please copy this. And they copy this onto lines. And if you look at the last line, it says G, J, P, Q, and Y above the line. And this is an example of a student's handwriting who doesn't know that P's and Y's start on the line rather than they start halfway up the line, if you understand what I mean. And the G, and they're doing the same thing. Now to fix that isn't particularly hard. You basically have to tell them. And then, so I have a little checklist and go around and look at all the students' handwriting And the general problems will be spacing, position, that we saw before, letter formation, some letters, maybe one letter that's not clear or it looks like another letter, and then are they writing too small or too large, and so on. Now, this might not seem like a major issue, especially with typing, but the same thing would apply to typing because that's also a form of literacy. And if you don't leave a space, if you leave a space before, after a word before a comma, that comma disappears to the next line. And students just need to be told that's not the way that English works. Now, this is the book that my wife and I, Emma Pathare and I, wrote a book for Cambridge called Unlock Basic Literacy, which is actually aimed at adult learners. And it uses first language methods that my children would have used to actually practice the formation of letters. And I think that that's a more comprehensive way of going about it. And you can see the double lines, or the lines there showing students how to write. So that would be another option, would be to either run a book like that alongside the course or prior to the course. Spelling, big one, isn't it? In fact, this is why I got interested in literacy. I was in the learning centre in my college, and teachers would send their learners down, and invariably it was, can you help them with their spelling? And my answer was invariably, well, no, I can't. I don't know how. It's too big. It's impossible, and we don't have material. So I started to develop, I realized that wasn't a good answer, and I felt the need to start to develop strategies to help them. And actually, I was in contact with a very, very important kind of expert in this field, Dr. Mick Randall at the time, and he did point out that the problem is also a methodology, communicative method problem, because the communicative method doesn't group words according to spelling patterns. It groups them according to topics so that you can communicate about them. Literacy teacher, usually all caps in literacy classes, sit on mats. And that's the reason for that is, of course, the spelling pattern. But buses and trains, which are grouped by topic, don't help us to teach that. Now, what can we do about spelling if we can't teach the whole of spelling? I think the single most important message would be focus on regularity rather than irregularity. To do that, it helps if you to understand that there's words called sight words, and any literacy teacher will be aware of the fact that some very common words don't follow spelling patterns. Things like one should be own, and two, what's that W doing there? But it's very, very common words. And they're treated as sight words, and we don't actually address them from the spelling point of view, because if you do, then what you're doing is saying this is very irregular, and look, they're everywhere. Much better to focus on the regularity, and there is a huge amount of regularity in spelling. And let me give you an example. If I ask you, when you're sitting there, assuming you are listening here, I give you a word like noi, which doesn't exist, but if I ask you to spell it, I would be very surprised if most of you didn't write N-O-Y. And that's because you're following very powerful spelling rules, which are pretty universal. And the example here, again, you'll need to look closely. What I did is I took all the first 1,000 words in a 1,000-word list. This is some time ago when we were using a 1,000-word list. All the words which had the sound oi in from the 1,000 words, and there were 10. And the students, all they have to do is to separate them into spelling patterns, either OI or OY. And the answer is this. So all of that's all the words with the sound oi in a whole 1,000 words. And if you look, it's very regular. And that's a very powerful message. The only one that is different is employee, which happens to have a suffix, before that, it's still regular. It's still the ends in OY, and the beginning, in the middle, OI. Now, there are words which won't follow that, but it's much more powerful in this situation to focus on the regular. Nobody really wants to be told that something's unlearnable because it's random, and I think that's a message we can give sometimes. Another way to do it is, this is a list of words around a topic, which we were using for IELTS, and what I did is a page of work next to it. The top part looks at meaning and use of the words. They put these words into paragraphs and look at the meaning. But the bottom part looks for spelling correspondences. So exercise 2, what sound do 8, 15, no, 16 and 18, my eyes going, 16 and 18 have in common. Funeral, copyright, funeral, fade, and what was it? And forget. The sound is F. Sorry, the sound is F, and there's two spellings of it. So by building in an extra spelling activity into general vocabulary work and worksheets, and the bottom part shows pattern seeking, and I want that students to realize that spelling is just patterns, really. Copying is something that's very useful. If I asked you to copy that in Arabic and you weren't an Arabic speaker, I can see a lot of people are, it would be quite challenging, and it's very useful to be able to do that at lower levels of literacy. But of course, if you ask people to copy, you might feel it's a bit beneath them or easy, especially as adults. So what you can do is add a challenge. For example, I'd ask people to copy this, but to put the letters in that are missing. It becomes more cognitive, but it still has the advantage of slowing them down and making them think about the spellings and so on, and letter formation. And then I can use that, the number 3, how many full stops and sentences are there, to do further literacy work. So the fact is that the number of full stops and sentences will be the same, apart from the fact there's an I here, which takes it up to one more capital letter than full stop. Punctuation is a very interesting thing because it's very powerful in terms of meaning. A simple trick that I've started to use, or I've been using for a while, in fact, to attach punctuation wherever possible to language. So secondly, finally, in my opinion, and so on the left, always take a comma. So why not teach it with the comma? Whereas my first reason is that it doesn't have a comma. If it did, it would have a pause, which would take you backward or to go forwards. My first reason is that, Not my first reason is that, forward, So that makes it much easier for students to start to get a feel for punctuation, especially if you combine it with showing them why you want to pause. Sounds and spelling. This is another important part of literacy. This is from the Unlock Basic Literacy book. Now, in this, they listen and read and trace letters. That's the bit that would be missing from most normal books not focusing on literacy. And in fact, with this one, again, listen and read and trace and match. So the tracing, which is the literacy point, letter formation, is inserted into a fairly standard matching activity. Okay, but this session was called literacy, basic literacy, but I think it's more than that, because I think that we really have to think about is methodology. Came back to the beginning, this methodology can't work as it's intended to when the actual reading and writing is much bigger part of the lesson than it should be. In fact, it would take all the cognitive processing of the student. In fact, as a textbook writer, half of my job is writing text. Everything, blah, blah, blah. We input grammar through text. First thing in any unit of most course books will be a text containing grammar, vocabulary, maybe ideas for the session, things we write text for generating discussion, text to respond to, please give advice to this person who has a problem, you should do this. And we model writing. Texts are everywhere, but those texts can be in themselves very off-putting and difficult for students to deal with. I do believe, though, writing models of text which model writing are crucial, because that's exactly what students need if you haven't got the same literacy as conventions as English. So, for example, this is a very simple one where this is a text with no actual writing. I'm just trying to show the relative size of paragraphs of an introduction and middle body paragraphs in conclusion, which is not a given. This is an example of non-text driven grammar lesson. It doesn't start with a big text where students are expected to find examples of the passive. It starts with two very simple texts, which are basically one line with an extremely highlighted, very easy to see grammar form, which then in exercise 3, they have to just identify, which is it may seem very simple, but it's not if you're doing it in a script which isn't that familiar. And then they move on to writing them and then eventually producing. So you're kind of reversing the process. I think I'm limited in time for this. What I was trying to do is to show you a little overview of what I think we need to be doing, which is, yes, we need to address literacy, but also I'm pretty sure that we need to rethink the course books and the materials we use in terms of what effect they have if the literacy element is too difficult for students to get the actual language learning happening. And I think this is all the more important when you think how important English language is to people nowadays. But like it or not, it's make or break for many people. And if they're being held back in language learning by a literacy issue, I think that's our job to try to address that. And I thank you. There's 3 books here I just meant. If you go back and look at this, it's not a bibliography, but these are 3 books which I've mentioned. The English writing system is fascinating. It's by the tutor taught me my master's, Vivian Cook, but he's the expert on this. It's a really good book on the English writing system. The bottom book, The Survey of English Spelling, is ridiculous. It's thousands of pages, but if you like spelling, it's amazing. And the middle book is the one that I've referred to a couple of times here. So this is a very short question time. Thank you very much, and I hope.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Gary. Thanks a lot for that. A lot of good examples in there. Let me just have a look to see if there's any questions here. I've got one here about pronunciation. So question coming in: how can you teach the different pronunciation of sounds? Basically, a basic pronunciation thing. Just as with me trying to pronounce your name at the beginning, Gary. Yeah, it was how can you teach the different pronunciation of sounds?
Well, it's difficult. I actually think that you need a code, basically the phonemic script, to do that, because English has 44 sounds but only 26 letters, and you need something to link so students start to see that there is a sound which is represented by different letter combinations. Now, people are very resistant to that, but if you teach it in a very simple, there's only a few which are different, significant, like the sh symbol, for example. And I think if you build up that, that's an important tool. But yeah, you need to be isolating the sounds and then teaching them. But the question is how much time you've got to do that. So maybe focusing on the ones which are different, which are unique, or which don't exist in the language. So, for example, the problem with Arabic of p and b is significant because it doesn't really differentiate. So just focusing on the more significant.
Question here is: do you have any tips for making lessons fun and easy to remember for with basic writing for younger children?
I don't teach younger children, to be honest. I think is writing. There's naturally a work part of learning writing. It is work, and you can't get around that. I use a very, very step-by-step approach to writing, where I think the actual I don't really believe very much in giving people long pieces of writing to write and then spending hours correcting it and giving it back, because I don't think that's for teachers or for the student. So I much prefer to give short sets that work on a paragraph level to something that they can approach. So giving them lots of models that I think that they could achieve, and then work towards that. It's not, I wouldn't say that's fun, but it gives satisfaction and a sense of actual progress, which I think can be lacking in the writing classroom. Just correcting can be very demotivating.
Just having a look at any other questions coming in here. There's one which says, how complex is communicative competence? What's the effects of learning support like scaffolding activities on encouraging students to express their understanding?
I don't know if off the top of my head, to be honest. I think that communicative. I'm a bit of a just-in-time person, so I think that classroom practice of communicative activities is important, but I'm not sure how much effect it has if they're not in a situation where they can use it in real life. So communicative competence, I think, would come out in real life situations. So when I said before about find a person who, I've never done that in real life. I've never run around a supermarket saying find a person who's buying butter beans. I think obviously it's useful, but ideally I think would be in a situation where it's, especially in academic English, where you can immediately use it in something that would relate to your academic pursuit. it's a problem we've had over the years with IELTS, that students who are not really full of ideas yet are being judged on the quality of their ideas on topics that they're not really interested in or going to study. And the new exam we're using, the UAE, doesn't really focus on ideas. That's not considered make or break. The idea is that when they go into their program, then they'll get the ideas from their program choice. I don't know if that's related to the question.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more. Let me just have a look down the questions here. What are the productive ways to improve writing aside from essays and longer work, perhaps?
I think when I'm talking about people with literacy issues, I think that it's very important to focus on sentence level writing. Certainly, my students, just because syntax is really important, I find a lot of students won't include a subject. For example, after a connecting expression, they'll say, "This means that happy," or rather say, "This means that people are happy." So I like to do a lot of work on the sentence that comes after a connective, and seeing it more as a building block towards essays. Essays are an outcome, I suppose, of smaller bits of writing, and I think you can greatly improve any essay if you've done more work than is normal, that's normally focused on in, say, course books, on sentence level. And in fact, you can analyze sentences and find there's not that many types. They're masterable. Basic sentences, there's not that many. They tend to follow certain patterns, so you'll often have subject to be adjective, or subject to be comparative, or subject there's subject modal, and the subject can be long, so work on things like longer subjects.
Thank you. That's fine. Great. It's all we've got time for now.